So this brings us to our very first graph that we're going to be covering in this class. It's called the production possibilities curve. Sometimes I refer to this as the PPC, production possibilities curve, and sometimes I will refer to it as PPF, production possibilities frontier. They mean the same thing. So production possibilities curve, production possibilities frontier, PPC, PPF, same thing. And basically what this shows is a graph that depicts all of the different mixes of output you can produce given limited resources. For example, here we've got a choice to produce two different things, trucks or tanks. And we have limited resources to produce this. So let's say we have a fixed amount of land, labor, and capital. Let's just make things simple. Let's say we have only labor involved here. So let's say we have 4 workers. Well, 5, let's call it 5 workers. And we have a choice. Do we send them to some workers to produce trucks or some to produce tanks? If we send all of the workers to produce trucks, right? We have no workers to produce tanks. And if we put every single worker to work to their full capability, we could produce up to 5 trucks, but 0 tanks, because we have nobody working in the tank factory. Well, what if we want some tanks? Well, if we want some tanks, we got to send some of these workers over to the tank factory. So let's say we send some workers over and we produce 1 less. Let me just clean this up here. Let's say we produce 1 less truck. That frees up some workers that we send over to the tank factory. And if we put all of them to work, we're able to produce 2 tanks and, of course, 4 trucks. That's kind of a 1 to 2 ratio, right? We give up 1 truck, we get 2 tanks. Well, let's say you like that trade-off and you give up another truck, and you move from point B to point C. Now, do you see that we have now 3 tanks, which means we got 1 extra tank, and we gave up 1 truck, but now we have a 1-to-1 ratio. Do you see how the price of tanks have gone up? Before we gave up 1 truck and we got 2 tanks. Now we give up 1 truck and we only get 1 tank. So we're getting less in return, giving up the same amount. And we see that as we continue moving along the PPC. If we give up another truck, we go from point C to point D, and in this case, we get basically 0.75 tanks. And of course, graphically, the reason for this is because we have this bowed curve right here, right? This curve is bowed. But what this is really showing you is how compatible your factors of production, labor, are when you move it from one activity, truck production, to tank production. In other words, as we send workers from trucks to tanks, we get less and less in return. And the reverse would be true. If we start with 5 tanks and we start by giving up 1 tank to free up workers to send them to produce trucks, we're eventually going to get less and less in return, because after we send the best workers capable of producing the other good, we keep sending more workers, but those additional workers are less capable than the first workers. So the curve here is bowed. So this is one way to show scarcity and inefficiency to a certain degree with the production possibilities curve. Also, this point right here, 5 trucks and 3 tanks is impossible. It's an impossible mix given our limited resources. we can produce only a mix of trucks and tanks that are either on or inside the production possibilities curve. And we could write this, out in a tabular form too. This information you see here is basically the information that you see here. Also, we could, let me go past this slide. We could basically look at inefficiency. Let me get to that part right here. And trade-offs. So let me give you a good example of a country that's been in the news lately, North Korea. North Korea, for being a very poor country, has a very, very large military. Now, even though the United States spends much more money on its military than North Korea, the United States doesn't pay as high a price in terms of opportunity cost. Now, remember, opportunity cost is what you give up when you make a choice. When North Korea chooses to contribute more to their military, they give up more than what Americans give up, even though we spend more in dollar terms. North Korea is very, very poor. So what happens is when they dedicate more resources to the military, they actually have to give up very important things like food. So if I were to draw a production possibilities curve that looks at food as one possible activity and military as another possible activity, and let's say for the sake of argument that they're operating at point P, they're utilizing all of our resources. If they say, hey, look, we want more military output, in other words, they have H right now, we want more than H. Well, in order to do that, they've got to give up food production. And you could see that that's what you see here, right? Less food in order to get more military buildup. Now, to a certain degree, that's true for the United States, but not to the degree with North Korea. And one way of looking at opportunity costs when it comes to, let's say, military spending is looking at your military spending as a percentage of your economy. Now, we use a term called GDP to define our economy. And we're going to be covering that in Chapter 2 if you're in micro, and Chapter 5 if you're in macro. And that's one way of showing you what you give up. In other words, if your military spending is a higher percentage of your overall economy, that means you must be giving up more of other aspects of your economy in order to get that level of military output. And you can see North Korea, I believe this is 2014 data, North Korea, 23% of their economy is dedicated to military production. The United States is at 3.5%. So now keep in mind, that's 3.5% of a larger pie. So in other words, think of this. This pie represents the size of North Korea's economy, and this is the size of the United States economy. Well, roughly a third. Oh, I'm sorry, a third is right about here. Is North Korea's economy. That's not, well, I'm a fifth, I'm sorry. Let me draw that more. So we're talking about a fifth of their economy is the military right here. And for the United States, it's this. Now, but since this slice is a part of a much bigger pie, the United States spends much more. But because the slice is so small relative to the overall economy, that's another way of saying the United States doesn't pay as high an opportunity cost as North Korea. Now, believe me, you can debate, is this appropriate, 3.5% of the overall economy dedicated to the military? And that that's entirely appropriate to debate that. But what you can say is the United States doesn't pay as high a price for its military spending as a country, let's say, like North Korea. Now, the United States had has changed in terms of its opportunity cost when it comes to military spending over time. Look at this. This graph starts from 1965 and goes to about 2005, right? And you can see during the height of the Vietnam War, the United States was spending about dedicating about 9.7% of its economy towards the military. And then you can see this started to drop as the Vietnam War ended. And then the Cold War started to heat up during the early 80s. And you can see we started to spend more on the military, even as a percentage of the economy, even though that we were not at war with anybody. And then the Berlin Wall fell, communism collapsed, Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. I'm sorry, 1989 right here. And you could see the United States was spending less as a percentage of the economy. And then we had 9/11 right here. And this went up to about 4.5%. So it's changed over time. In other words, the opportunity cost for military spending has changed over time. Another way of looking at opportunity cost, again, one way is to look at, so this is 2010 military spending. And the United States in 2010, during the height of the response to 9/11, and the two wars we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were spending 4.8% of the 4% of our economy was dedicated to military spending, and we spent a total of $700 billion in total. Now, what you could do is you could look at other countries' spending, and if you added up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, the 14 largest spenders on military activity combined does not add up to what the United States spent in 2010. But notice how they also include what the spending reflects as a percentage of their economy. And you can see Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia spent a fraction of what the United States spent, that fraction was still 10.4% of their overall economy. So this is another way of putting things like military spending in perspective in terms of opportunity cost. So another thing that the economy shows us, or the production possibilities curve, is efficiency. What do I mean by efficiency? Well, are you fully utilizing your resources, your land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship? Now let's take a look at the graph again. Come on. If you have a production mix that's well inside, so in other words, here you're producing 3 trucks and 2 tanks, that's possible. But notice how this point Y, is inside the curve, which means it is possible for you to produce more of both goods if you moved this way, which must mean you're not fully utilizing your resources. And this is another way of showing inefficiency. You're not fully utilizing your resources. And of course, we call that unemployment. Unemployment is unused labor, and that's a sign of waste. And you can see that different economies have different levels of utilization of their factors of production. As of, let's say, March of 2018, there were 6.6 million people looking for work who couldn't find work. And that means we're not fully utilizing our labor. And if you wanted to put that in perspective, the United States, which is right here, in 2007, last part of 2017, 4.1% of the overall labor force was unemployed. Now compare that to Greece. About 21% of labor force was unemployed. So in other words, if we were to look at the United States production possibilities curve, we would put it the curve point right there. If we were to look at Greece's production possibilities curve, we would put it far further away from the boundary because they have more resources, in this case labor, that are not being utilized. So that's another way of looking at the production possibilities curve as in terms of what it can show us. Okay, so hopefully we've set up a good foundation to for the overall class, and you have a good idea of what we're covering in chapter 1. And again, like always, if you have any questions, please email me.